Picture the whole world as one piece of land. Not 7 continents scattered across the globe with oceans between them, but a single enormous landmass so vast you could, in theory, walk from what is now the North Pole all the way to the South Pole and never once cross the sea. One continent, one coastline wrapped around the entire planet, one endless interior stretching farther than any animal could ever travel in a lifetime. This was Pangaea, and for over 100 million years, it was the world. There was nothing else. So let me take you there, because the life that filled this place was stranger than almost anything that has lived since, and almost nothing about it would look familiar to you.
First, you need to understand the scale, because the scale is the whole story. When you gather every continent into one, you create something that has never existed before or since. A landmass so wide that its center is thousands of miles from the nearest ocean in every direction. And the ocean is where weather comes from. Rain is just moisture carried inland off the sea. But on Pangaea, the moisture never made it to the middle. It rained itself out long before it got there. So the heart of the supercontinent became the driest place the land has ever known. A desert bigger than any desert today. Bigger than the Sahara, bigger than all our modern deserts combined. An expanse of red sand and bare rock and cracked earth that went on for thousands of miles in every direction, where it might not rain for years at a time. And here's what made it almost unlivable. With no ocean nearby to soften the temperature, the interior swung between brutal extremes, scorching days where the heat could kill you, and freezing nights where it all bled away into a clear sky. Summers and winters so violent that scientists have a name for the weather system that ruled this world, the megamonsoon. Once a year, the seasons would reverse with terrifying force, dragging dry air and then heavy rain across the coasts, in a cycle so powerful nothing today compares to it. The edges of Pangaea, near the sea, could be lush, but the center was a furnace and a freezer taking turns, and almost nothing lived there. Now let's go back to the early days of this world, around 290 million years ago, long before the first dinosaur ever drew breath. Because if you walk the wetlands near Pangaea's coast in this era, the animal you'd meet first is one most people get completely wrong. You'd see a creature the size of a large alligator, low to the ground with sprawled legs, and rising from its back an enormous fan of skin stretched over tall bony spines. A sail. This is Dimetrodon, and almost everyone who sees it calls it a dinosaur. It isn't. It's not even close. Dimetrodon went extinct around 40 million years before the very first dinosaur appeared. There is more time between Dimetrodon and the first dinosaur than there is between the first dinosaur and you. And here's the stranger truth. Dimetrodon is closer to you than it is to any dinosaur. It belongs to a group called the synapsids, the lineage that would one day, tens of millions of years later, lead to mammals, to us. So that sail-backed predator hunting in the swamps is less like a lizard and more like an incredibly distant ancestor of every mammal alive. The sail itself is still a bit of a mystery. It may have helped the animal warm up in the morning sun and shed heat in the afternoon. It may have been for showing off to mates. We're still not certain, but it made Dimetrodon the apex predator of its world, the top hunter on a planet that hadn't yet imagined what was coming. Because these synapsids, these proto-mammals, didn't stay small or rare. For millions of years they ruled, the land filled with them. Some were predators with steak knife teeth. Others were stocky plant eaters built like barrels. There were the dicynodonts, beaked, tusked herbivores that rooted through the vegetation in herds, ranging from the size of a guinea pig to the size of a hippo. There were the gorgonopsians, saber-toothed hunters that stalked them, the lions of their day, with canines like daggers. If you had visited Pangaea in this age, you would have sworn the mammal relatives had won the planet for good. They were everywhere. They were the dominant life on Earth. And then the world ended. Around 252 million years ago, Pangaea was the stage for the single worst catastrophe life on this planet has ever endured. We call it the Permian Triassic Extinction, but it has another name, the Great Dying. It is the closest life has ever come to being wiped out completely. Massive volcanic eruptions tore open what is now Siberia. Not the gentle cones you're picturing, but floods of lava that poured across an area the size of a continent, burning for hundreds of thousands of years. They pumped so much carbon and poison into the air that the planet's whole system collapsed. The oceans acidified and lost their oxygen. The land baked. The air itself may have become toxic. When it was over, somewhere around 90% of all species on Earth were gone. Not 90% of individuals, 90% of all the kinds of life that existed. The oceans were nearly emptied. The great synapsid dynasties, the sailbacks and the saber-tooths and the barrel-bodied giants were almost entirely erased. Pangaea became for a time a graveyard, a scorched and silent supercontinent where the survivors were few and scattered. But life doesn't stop. It waits and it rebuilds. And the animal that inherited this broken world is one of the most remarkable survivors in all of history. It was a stocky, pig-sized creature with a flat face, 2 small tusks, and a body built like a barrel. Its name is Lystrosaurus, and after the Great Dying, it didn't just survive, it took over the entire planet. For a time, this one humble animal made up the overwhelming majority of all land life on Earth. Imagine walking across an entire supercontinent and seeing the same animal everywhere you went, on every coast, in every valley. One creature, almost alone, holding the whole world together. Why Lystrosaurus? We're still not fully sure. It may have been a burrower, digging into the ground to escape the killing heat, which would have sheltered it from the worst of the disaster. It seems to have been able to survive on very little, in a world that offered very little. Whatever the reason, this unassuming little tusked animal became the foundation that life rebuilt itself on. And because Pangaea was a single connected landmass, Lystrosaurus could spread across the whole of it. Its fossils have been found in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, and even in Antarctica. That fact, the same animal scattered across continents now separated by entire oceans, was one of the great early clues that all this land had once been joined. Now the world is recovering and we move into the next stage, the Triassic. And this is when something new begins to stir. In the shadow of the recovering synapsids, a different group of animals was quietly rising, the reptiles, the ancestors of crocodiles, and alongside them, a small, fast, unremarkable-looking group that nobody at the time would have bet on. Slim, long-legged little hunters that ran on 2 legs. These were the first dinosaurs. They did not arrive as kings. For the early part of their existence, dinosaurs were the underdogs, small and rare, scurrying around a world still dominated by other reptiles and the last of the mammal relatives. If you had walked Triassic Pangaea, you would not have pointed at these little creatures and predicted they would one day rule the Earth for over 150 million years. They were a footnote, a possibility, but they had something. They were efficient, they were quick, and they were perfectly suited to the harsh, dry, seasonal world that Pangaea had become. And slowly, over millions of years, they began to take over. And throughout all of this, across every age, there was one more thing about Pangaea you'd notice the moment you arrived: the bugs. With warm conditions and, in some periods, more oxygen in the air than today, the insects and their relatives grew to sizes that would stop your heart. Earlier, just before Pangaea fully formed, dragonflies cruised the swamps with wingspans as wide as a hawk's, over 2 feet across. There were millipedes the length of a car, armored giants that crawled through the undergrowth. The small scuttling things you ignore today once grew to the size of dogs. On Pangaea, you would never have stopped watching the ground and the sky. So picture the whole journey of this world. It begins with sail-backed proto-mammals ruling lush coastal swamps. It builds into a planet teeming with the ancestors of mammals, herds, and hunters covering the land. Then, it is nearly destroyed in the worst catastrophe life has ever faced, reduced to a near-empty desert held together by a single stubborn survivor. And then, from that emptiness, the dinosaurs quietly begin their rise in a world of giant insects, endless red deserts, and a sky ruled by a monsoon unlike anything we know. And then Pangaea did the last thing it would ever do. It began to break apart. Deep beneath the crust, the same forces that had assembled it slowly tore it back open. Around 180 million years ago, great cracks spread across the supercontinent, and into those cracks poured the sea. The single landmass split into pieces, and those pieces drifted apart, carrying their animals with them, sending the descendants of those early dinosaurs off onto separate continents that would one day become the world you know. The single coastline became 7, the one desert became many lands, and the animals stranded on each fragment evolved in isolation, which is part of why life looks so different from one continent to another even now. We live on the broken pieces of that world. The fossils in the rock beneath your feet, no matter where you are, were once part of one connected land. The coal we burn formed in Pangaea's swamps. The deserts of its dead interior are buried in stone on continents now thousands of miles apart. For over 100 million years, there was one world, one land, one story unfolding across a single unbroken stage. And every continent you've ever stood on is just a shattered fragment of it, still drifting slowly apart.